Hello, my name is Ann Cheragino, and this is my presentation for Info 5720 on copyright and what that lesson would look like for my students. Looking at the Assure model, there's several steps that we have to look at. Um, Before I get to the different particulars of the Assure model, I just kind of wanted to outline sort of how the lesson would go in my mind. So after doing the lecture, that was the separate recording that we already did, after doing the lecture and explaining to the students all of the particulars and the technical aspects of copyright laws and rules, they would then go and create a checklist that would be used for the research assignment that they were doing with their classroom teacher. That checklist would then outline that they create would be a way for them to self-check for themselves um, whether or not they are within the bounds of using copyright appropriately. So it's something that they would come together and do as a group of, say, two or three in order to create it. So there's some group dynamics there as well. But then they would have that sheet independently to use to check their own work in their presentations. So looking at that, so after that overview then, what does the Assure model look like? So the A of the Assure model asks us to analyze learners. So for this group of learners, I chose the demographic that's very similar to where I live here in the community that I live in Oregon. So I chose ninth grade students at a suburban high school. They're mostly white, with approximately a third of the students of either Vietnamese or Filipino descent. The strengths of the students as a whole is that they're pretty average writers. There are a few who are above or below average. So since they're sort of average in their writing, coming up with the self-check that they're going to do shouldn't be a huge difficulty. For some of those students for whom it might be a problem to word things, I think organizing groups in an intentional way to help balance that out would be good. Challenges for this age group as freshmen, the students have not had much exposure to using the internet for online research. They've had a little bit probably in middle school, a brief introduction to that, but this is a time where they're really coming up with a major project on their own. They have had some exposure to like don't copy other people's work or don't commit plagiarism, but it's sort of scattered and they may not fully understand what all of that is. So a pretest will be given to the students on copyright rules. And then after I review the results of the pretest, I would intentionally group the students in pairs or groups of three in such a way that there would be hopefully one person in each group or pair who has some background understanding or remembering of what a copyright infringement looks like, what kinds of rules we might need for copyright. So then that way, as they work together, there's someone who already has a little bit of prior knowledge who can help maybe the other people in the group for whom it may be a newer topic for them. For the first S of the Assure model, we have to state standards and objectives. So my objectives of the students are number one, they'll be able to define what copyright is. Number two, students will analyze sources. So they'll be able to determine whether or not those sources and the way that they're being used comply with copyright law. And then number three, they'll be able to create that self-check for use for their own projects and presentations. So as a way to make sure they're using things the way that they are intended to be used. The two standards that really stood out to me here were 1.2.c. Students demonstrate an understanding of and respect for the rights and obligations of using and sharing intellectual property. So just really understanding that this isn't just doing it for the sake of doing it, but there's a moral obligation here as well. It's good and right that we should give credit or monetary compensation or whatever to the people who are creating the things that we want to use. And the second one was 1.7.c. Students contribute constructively to project teams, assuming various roles and responsibilities to work effectively toward a common goal. Since they'll be putting together those self-checks as a group, that seemed to fit that standard very well. For the second S, we have to select strategies and resources. So there are a number of different things that they'll be able to use. A lecture explaining copyright rules. So they'll have the lecture and itself, so the slides, so that serves as both an audio and a visual, my voice, but then also the information that's on the slides. And then while they're looking at and listening to the lecture, I would have a guided note sheet for them. The first part, like the top part of the sheet or the front half of the sheet, would be used in such a way that there would be some sort of fill in the blanks, a space to write the definition that I give them for copyright law. But then the bottom part or the back would be where they would summarize the information and sort of synthesize everything that they learned at the end to really show me that they comprehend the general gist of it, but also its importance and some of those other aspects that go beyond just the simple definition. And then online videos for reteaching if necessary. I've included links here that they can go to be able to revisit these topics if they need it. So for those struggling learners, people who might benefit from another multimedia presentation or hearing things again or doing it on their own, they can review those two videos as well as the lecture if they needed to. So since all of this would theoretically be available on the library website or on their classroom website, then they would be able to reference those things and rewatch things as needed. For the U part of the Assure model, it asks us to utilize resources, focusing on resources, environment, and the learners. So for resources, we obviously have the recorded lecture, the guided notes that they would be completing along with that, the requirements for the group project, and then videos for reteaching if necessary. For the environment itself, I think depending upon what the library situation is like or what the classroom situation is like with regards to furniture, that can really affect how this could be done, but I think it can be done in a couple of different ways. So I think that it could be such that if the students all had individual desks, they could be in more of a lecture format to start and then have the option to move their desks in order to do group work when they start coming up with their checklist. The other situation could be if they are in a room where there's tables, they could already be in their groups and they could either just try and turn their chairs and listen to the lecture, or another option would be for them to be able to look at the lecture and listen to the lecture on an iPad or a Chromebook or something like that if that was available to them, and then go right into their group work. For the learners themselves, I would do a pretest to see what it is that they know initially before we get started. And then as far as an explanation of real world applications and implications, I have some of that in the lecture for the students too, just so that they understand that this isn't something that is only related to the world of academia, why it's important to give credit, what are the moral aspects of this, and I really want to impart that upon the students. For the R, for the requiring learner participation, students will work as a group to put together that self-check of criteria for when they do their research projects and their presentations with their classroom teacher. And those will be used to determine whether or not they are breaking copyright rules or laws in their presentation. My hope would be that this would go beyond just this single use with this one teacher, but it could be something that either the teacher sees one group that does a really phenomenal job, and then that teacher could reuse that checklist with other students, or the teacher could synthesize what they see from lots of different groups and put together one checklist. So then that way it's a resource that they're using throughout their ninth grade year and not something that's just limited to this one project. The E part of the Assure model asks us to evaluate and revise. So there's a rubric which focuses on 4 different criteria for the students. So it asks them, it evaluates whether or not they're able to define copyright law, define it correctly, explain it well, determine the criteria for evaluating materials, and then evaluating those different types of media to see if they fall under copyright infringement, and then also some self-reflection of the materials that they chose with their presentation to see whether or not it fits within the guidelines that they have drawn up for themselves. So there's my explanation about how my lesson fulfills all the different aspects of the Assure model. I hope that you found it helpful and interesting, and thank you for your attention today.